They saw the floral dress, the nervous smile, and the way she clutched her purse like a shield. They heard her soft voice apologizing for being late and watched her fumble with her visitor's badge at the security checkpoint. To everyone at Riverside Military Training Facility that humid Tuesday morning, Sarah Mitchell was exactly what she appeared to be, a grieving widow way out of her depth, trying to keep her deceased husband's business from crumbling. The contractors smirked behind their clipboards. The military brass exchanged knowing glances. Even the janitor shook his head as she struggled to find the right building. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. None of them knew that in exactly 47 minutes, this same woman would strip down a military-grade sniper rifle to its component parts and reassemble it faster than any active-duty soldier in the room. None of them suspected that her trembling fingers would transform into precision instruments that moved with the fluidity of someone who had done this exact task thousands of times before. And certainly none of them imagined that the quiet housewife apologizing for her nervousness would silence an entire room of hardened military professionals with a display of skill so flawless it would rewrite everything they thought they knew about her. But sometimes the most dangerous weapon is the one nobody sees coming. Sometimes strength hides behind the gentlest smile. And sometimes the person everyone dismisses is the one who's been waiting 20 years for the right moment to remind the world exactly who they used to be. The morning mist hung heavy over Riverside Military Training Facility, like a gray blanket that refused to lift. The Virginia humidity pressed against everything with the weight of an old grudge, making uniforms stick to skin and clipboards damp with condensation. Inside the main assembly hall, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across rows of metal tables where disassembled weapons lay waiting like mechanical puzzles. The air smelled of gun oil, metal cleaner, and the particular tension that comes when millions of dollars in defense contracts hang in the balance. Today was demonstration day. Representatives from 6 different military contracting companies had gathered to prove their worth, to show that their firms deserved the coveted spot as the Army's next primary weapons maintenance provider. The contract was worth $2-3 million over 3 years, and everyone in the room knew it. You could taste the competition in the recycled air, see it in the way grown men adjusted their ties and checked their watches every 30 seconds. Jake Harrison stood near the main demonstration table like he owned it. His company, Harrison Defense Technologies, had held similar contracts for the past 8 years, and Jake carried himself with the swagger of a man who had never lost a bid. His jaw was square, his handshake firm, and his confidence so thick you could practically spread it on toast. He wore his success like an expensive cologne, obvious and impossible to ignore. When Jake spoke, other contractors listened. When he laughed, they laughed too, even when the jokes weren't funny. He was the kind of man who had never met a room he couldn't dominate or a deal he couldn't close. Marcus Chun from Precision Military Solutions hovered near the coffee station, nervously shuffling through his presentation materials for the 3rd time. His company was newer, hungrier, but Marcus carried the weight of trying too hard. Every gesture seemed calculated, every smile slightly forced. He'd practiced his pitch so many times that it had lost any trace of spontaneity, becoming a rehearsed performance that somehow made him seem less competent rather than more. Tony Rodriguez represented Global Defense Systems, a mid-sized firm that specialized in logistics. He was the veteran of the group, old enough to have gray at his temples and scars on his hands from actual field work. Tony didn't need to posture. He'd earned his place through decades of solid, reliable work, and everyone respected him for it. When Tony spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had assembled weapons under enemy fire and knew the difference between theory and reality. Rebecca Walsh from Advanced Tactical Solutions was the only other woman in the room besides Sarah, but she belonged here in a way that Sarah clearly didn't. Rebecca wore her tailored blazer like armor, spoke in crisp military terminology, and had a handshake that could crack knuckles. She'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan before transitioning to the private sector, and her credentials were printed in bold letters across every piece of marketing material her company produced. Rebecca was what Sarah was supposed to be: professional, confident, unquestionably qualified. And then there was Sarah Mitchell. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had arrived 15 minutes late, parking her aging Honda Civic between a Mercedes and a BMW like an apology made of metal and rust. The security guard at the front gate had to explain the visitor check-in process twice because she seemed confused by the electronic scanner. She wore a navy blue dress with small white flowers that looked like it had been purchased from a department store clearance rack, and she carried a brown leather purse that had seen better decades. Her wedding ring caught the light when she signed the visitor log with handwriting that looked more suited to grocery lists than defense contracts. Sarah's company, Mitchell Defense Solutions, existed primarily on paper and in the fading memories of her late husband David's reputation. David Mitchell had been a respected figure in military contracting, known for his innovative approaches to weapons maintenance and his ability to solve problems that stumped larger firms. But David had been dead for 18 months, killed in a car accident that left Sarah not just widowed, but suddenly responsible for a business she had never really understood. The company's client list had shrunk to almost nothing. The workshop sat mostly empty. The bank account grew thinner each month. Everyone knew the story because everyone in the military contracting world eventually heard everything. Sarah Mitchell was the grieving widow trying to honor her husband's memory by keeping his company alive, but she was in way over her head. It was touching in a sad sort of way, but it wasn't business. This was a room for professionals, not for housewives playing at careers they'd inherited by accident. Colonel Roberts entered the assembly hall with the measured stride of a man who had commanded respect for so long that he no longer needed to demand it. His uniform was pressed to mathematical precision, his silver hair cut to regulation length, and his presence immediately shifted the energy of the room from casual competition to formal evaluation. Colonel Roberts was the decision-maker, the man whose signature would appear on the winning contract, and everyone in the room understood that their next 3 years of income depended on impressing him. The colonel surveyed the gathered contractors with eyes that had seen everything the military had to offer and found most of it wanting. He'd been evaluating defense contractors for 15 years, long enough to spot competence from across a room and incompetence from twice that distance. He'd seen companies rise and fall based on single demonstrations, watched careers built and destroyed in the space of an afternoon. Today's evaluation would follow a simple format that had served him well. Each company would demonstrate their capabilities through a practical test of weapons assembly and maintenance. Speed mattered, but precision mattered more. Anyone could rush through a task and hope for the best, but military equipment demanded perfection. Lieutenant Davis stood beside Colonel Roberts with a clipboard thick with evaluation forms and a stopwatch that would measure success in tenths of seconds. Davis was young enough to still believe that everything in the military could be quantified and ranked, organized into neat categories that made decision-making simple. He'd prepared detailed scoring rubrics and backup timekeeping systems because he understood that fairness required documentation. Davis had reviewed each company's qualifications the night before, and he already had a pretty good idea of how today would unfold. The test itself was straightforward. Each contractor would be given 30 minutes to demonstrate their firm's approach to weapons maintenance using a disassembled M24 sniper rifle system. The weapon had been broken down to its component parts by military armorers that morning, each piece cleaned and inspected to ensure a fair starting point. The contractors would explain their methodologies, demonstrate their techniques, and answer questions about troubleshooting and quality control. It was the kind of practical evaluation that separated real expertise from marketing presentations. Jake Harrison would go first, of course. He'd specifically requested the opening slot because he understood the psychology of competitions. Go first, set the standard high, and watch everyone else struggle to match your performance. Jake's presentation would be polished, his assembly technique flawless, and his confidence infectious. He'd probably finish in under 20 minutes and spend the remaining time answering questions with the ease of someone who had done this dance many times before. Marcus Chun would follow Jake, which put him in the unfortunate position of trying to outshine a master showman. Marcus would be technically competent, but nervous, probably taking the full 30 minutes and second-guessing himself throughout the process. His explanations would be thorough but forgettable, the kind of solid performance that earned respect but didn't win contracts. Tony Rodriguez would bring decades of experience to his demonstration, approaching the task with methodical precision. Rather than flashy technique, Tony didn't need to prove anything to anyone, which paradoxically made his presentation more impressive. He'd work quietly, efficiently, explaining his choices with the calm authority of someone who had earned his reputation through consistency rather than brilliance. Rebecca Walsh would remind everyone why military experience mattered in military contracting. Her assembly technique would be textbook perfect, her explanations crisp and professional, and her confidence genuine rather than performed. Rebecca was Jake's only real competition, and everyone in the room knew it. Which left Sarah Mitchell. Sarah sat in a folding chair near the back of the room, looking like she was trying to make herself invisible. She'd positioned herself behind a support pillar where she could observe without drawing attention, and she kept checking her watch, as if she had somewhere more important to be. Her purse sat in her lap like a security blanket, and she'd already apologized twice for things that didn't require apologies, bumping into a chair that was already askew, asking if it was okay to sit in an unmarked seat. Amanda Foster Colonel, Robert's administrative assistant, had tried to make Sarah feel welcome with the kind of forced cheerfulness reserved for lost tourists and confused relatives. Amanda had explained the schedule, offered coffee, and provided a folder of informational materials that Sarah probably wouldn't understand anyway. It was clear that Amanda felt sorry for Sarah, the way you might feel sorry for a child who'd wandered into an adult meeting by mistake. The other contractors largely ignored Sarah, not out of rudeness, but out of a practical understanding that she wasn't really competition. Jake Harrison had nodded politely when introduced, but immediately returned to his conversation with Rebecca about industry trends. Marcus Chun had smiled nervously and commented on how brave Sarah was for continuing her husband's work, which somehow managed to sound both supportive and condescending. Tony Rodriguez had been more direct, asking Sarah if she was sure she wanted to go through with the demonstration, offering to help her withdraw gracefully if she was having second thoughts. Only Rebecca Walsh had looked at Sarah with something, approaching professional interest, studying her the way a poker player might study an unknown opponent. But even Rebecca's attention was brief. After a moment of consideration, she'd apparently decided that Sarah posed no threat and returned to her own preparation. The truth was that Sarah Mitchell looked exactly like what everyone expected a grieving widow to look like. Her makeup was minimal and slightly smudged around the eyes, as if she'd been crying recently. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail that suggested function over style. Her posture was hunched, defensive, the body language of someone who expected to be dismissed. When she spoke, her voice was soft enough that people had to lean forward to hear her, and she had a habit of trailing off mid-sentence as if she wasn't sure her words were worth completing. But appearances, as Sarah Mitchell knew better than anyone, could be the most effective camouflage of all. The morning stretched on with the particular tension that comes before any formal evaluation. Coffee was consumed in measured sips. Nervous jokes were told and forgotten immediately. Equipment was checked and rechecked by people who had already checked it thoroughly the night before. The M24 rifle components lay spread across the demonstration table like the pieces of a complex puzzle, each part clean and precisely positioned according to military standards. Colonel Roberts reviewed his evaluation criteria one final time, though he could have recited them from memory. Technical proficiency would count for 40% of the total score. Speed and efficiency would account for 30%. Problem solving and adaptability would be worth 20%. The final 10% would be reserved for intangibles, the kind of qualities that couldn't be measured but could be recognized by someone with enough experience to know them when he saw them. Lieutenant Davis synchronized his stopwatch with the wall clock and confirmed that the video recording equipment was functioning properly. Everything would be documented, timed, and filed according to regulations that existed to prevent exactly the kind of favoritism and corruption that had plagued military contracting in previous decades. The process was designed to be fair, transparent, and objective, which meant that personal impressions and assumptions shouldn't matter. Except that personal impressions and assumptions always mattered, especially when they were so universal that they felt like facts. Sarah Mitchell checked her watch again and realized that her demonstration was scheduled for last. She'd specifically requested the final slot, explaining that she was nervous and hoped that watching the others might help her understand what was expected. It was the kind of request that reinforced everyone's impression of her as someone who was unprepared and overwhelmed. Exactly the sort of consideration you might extend to someone you already plan to reject gently. But Sarah hadn't requested the final slot because she was nervous. She'd requested it because she wanted to see exactly how fast the competition could assemble an M24 sniper rifle. She wanted to know what time she needed to beat to make the kind of impression that would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. She wanted to understand the stakes before she revealed that she had been playing an entirely different game all along. The demonstration was about to begin, and Sarah Mitchell was exactly where she needed to be. Colonel Roberts cleared his throat, and the assembly hall fell silent with the efficiency of a military unit responding to command. The fluorescent lights seemed to buzz louder in the sudden quiet, and the humid Virginia air hung motionless as if the building itself was holding its breath. Every contractor in the room understood that the next few hours would determine their financial future, but only Jake Harrison looked like he was genuinely enjoying the pressure. Jake stepped forward with the confident stride of a man who had never met a challenge he couldn't conquer. His charcoal gray suit was tailored perfectly, his tie knotted with mathematical precision, and his smile carried just enough warmth to seem genuine without appearing desperate. He'd been doing this dance for 8 years, winning contract after contract by combining technical excellence with the kind of showmanship that military brass secretly appreciated even when they claimed to value only results. "Gentlemen, ladies," Colonel Roberts announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "We'll begin with Harrison Defense Technologies. Mr. Harrison, you have 30 minutes to demonstrate your firm's approach to weapons maintenance and assembly. The clock starts when you touch the first component." Jake rolled up his sleeves with theatrical precision, revealing forearms that looked like they belonged to someone who actually used tools rather than just supervised their use. He'd started his career as an enlisted armorer before transitioning to the business side, and he made sure everyone knew it. Physical competence was part of his brand, as carefully cultivated as his reputation for reliability. The M24 rifle lay disassembled across the demonstration table like a mechanical autopsy, each component positioned according to military specifications. The barrel assembly rested on a padded cradle, the bolt mechanism sat in precise alignment with related parts, and the stock components were arranged in order of assembly complexity. It was a familiar sight to anyone who had worked with military weapons, but Jake approached it with the reverence of someone handling a religious artifact. "The M24 sniper weapon system," Jake began, his voice pitched to carry to every corner of the room, "represents the pinnacle of precision engineering in military small arms. Proper maintenance and assembly of this weapon system requires not just technical knowledge, but an understanding of how each component functions within the greater whole." Lieutenant Davis clicked his stopwatch, and Jake's hands moved to the weapon components with practiced fluidity. His fingers found the receiver, first lifting it with the careful grip of someone who understood that precision instruments demanded precise handling. Jake's movements were economical but not rushed, each action flowing naturally into the next, with the rhythm of someone who had performed this exact sequence hundreds of times. "Stock attachment is critical," Jake explained as his hands worked, never pausing in his assembly process. "Improper torque specifications can affect accuracy at extended ranges, while over-tightening can stress the receiver and lead to premature wear." His voice remained steady and conversational, even as his fingers moved with mechanical precision, threading bolts and aligning components with the efficiency of a Swiss watchmaker. Marcus Chen watched from his position near the coffee station, unconsciously taking notes on a legal pad, even though he'd studied Jake's techniques extensively. Marcus had spent the previous evening reviewing video footage of Jake's past demonstrations, looking for weaknesses or inefficiencies he might exploit. What he'd discovered instead was that Jake Harrison was genuinely excellent at his job, which made competing against him significantly more challenging. The bolt assembly slid into place with the satisfying click of precision-machined components finding their intended positions. Jake's hands moved to the trigger mechanism, his fingers dancing across springs and pins with the confidence of a pianist performing a familiar piece. Every movement was deliberate, every adjustment calculated, and every explanation delivered with the authority of someone who had earned his expertise through years of practical application. "Timing is crucial in trigger assembly," Jake continued, his hands never slowing. "Military specifications require a pull weight between 4 and 6 pounds, with minimal overtravel and a clean break. Civilian contractors who don't understand these requirements often produce weapons that fail inspection or, worse, fail in the field." The subtle dig at civilian contractors was delivered with Jake's trademark smile, but everyone in the room understood the implication. Jake Harrison had military experience. Jake Harrison understood what real soldiers needed from their equipment. Jake Harrison was the safe choice, the proven commodity, the contractor who delivered results rather than promises. Tony Rodriguez nodded slightly from his position near the wall, recognizing the quality of Jake's work even as he prepared to compete against it. Tony had assembled thousands of weapons during his military career, and he could appreciate technical excellence even when it came from a rival. Jake's technique was textbook perfect, his explanations accurate and comprehensive, and his timing flawless. Tony would need to be at his absolute best to match this performance. The barrel assembly required delicate handling, and Jake lifted it with the care of someone transporting nitroglycerin. Military sniper rifles were precision instruments calibrated to tolerances measured in thousandths of inches, and improper handling during assembly could affect accuracy at ranges where a missed shot might mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Jake understood this in his bones, and it showed in every careful movement. "Barrel alignment is non-negotiable," Jake said as he guided the barrel into the receiver, his movements slow and deliberate. "Any deviation from perfect alignment will compound exponentially at extended ranges. A misalignment of just 1/1000th of an inch at the muzzle can result in a miss of several inches at 800 yards. The rifle was beginning to take shape under Jake's hands, transforming from a collection of individual components into a weapon system capable of putting bullets precisely where they were intended to go. Each part found its designated place with the inevitability of a well-designed machine. And Jake's commentary provided a running explanation of the engineering principles that made such precision possible. Rebecca Walsh studied Jake's technique with the analytical eye of someone who had performed similar assemblies under significantly more stressful conditions. Combat assembly was different from demonstration assembly, requiring speed and efficiency that sometimes conflicted with the methodical precision Jake was displaying. Rebecca's approach would necessarily be different, emphasizing the practical realities of field conditions over the theoretical perfection of controlled environments. Sarah Mitchell remained in her chair near the back of the room, apparently absorbed in watching Jake's demonstration, but actually calculating the time required for each major assembly step. Her fingers moved slightly in her lap, unconsciously mimicking the motions she would use to perform the same tasks, and her eyes tracked Jake's hands with the focus of someone taking mental notes for future reference. The scope mounting required particular attention to detail, and Jake's explanation became more technical as he addressed the complexities of optical alignment and mechanical stability. Military scopes were engineered to withstand conditions that would destroy civilian equipment, but they still required proper installation to function reliably. Jake's hands moved with surgical precision, adjusting mounting rings and checking alignment with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that good enough was never actually good enough. Scope mounting is where many contractors fail, Jake said, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing hard-won wisdom. It's not enough to simply attach the scope to the rifle. Proper mounting requires understanding of optical physics, mechanical engineering, and the practical realities of field use. A scope that works perfectly on the range can fail catastrophically in combat if it's not mounted correctly. The demonstration table had been positioned to provide optimal viewing angles for the evaluation panel, and Jake made sure to orient his work so that Colonel Roberts and Lieutenant Davis could observe every detail of his assembly process. Transparency was part of the evaluation criteria, and Jake understood that perception was often as important as reality in competitive situations. Jake's hands moved to the final components with the confidence of someone approaching a familiar. Conclusion. The last few parts of any weapon assembly were often the most critical, requiring adjustments and fine-tuning that could make the difference between acceptable performance and exceptional accuracy. Jake's movements remained steady and controlled, his explanations clear and comprehensive, and his timing exactly where it needed to be. 22 minutes and 37 seconds after touching the first component, Jake Harrison stepped back from the demonstration table with a completed M24 rifle in his hands. The weapon looked exactly as it should, every component properly positioned and secured, every adjustment made to military specifications. Jake performed a final function check, cycling the bolt and dry-firing the rifle to verify proper operation before setting it carefully back on the table. Questions? Jake asked, his smile confident but not arrogant. He'd delivered exactly the kind of performance everyone expected from Harrison Defense Technologies, combining technical excellence with professional presentation in a package that was nearly impossible to criticize. Jake had set the bar high, and he knew it. Colonel Roberts nodded approvingly and made notes on his evaluation form while Lieutenant Davis recorded the final time. 22 minutes and 37 seconds was an excellent time for a demonstration assembly. Fast enough to show competence, but not so fast as to suggest corners had been cut. Jake had hit the sweet spot of competitive performance, and everyone in the room recognized it. Marcus Chun was called forward next, and his nervousness was immediately apparent in the way he approached the demonstration table. Where Jake had moved with confident purpose, Marcus hesitated slightly before touching the first component, his hands betraying the anxiety he was trying to hide behind professional competence. Marcus was technically skilled and thoroughly prepared, but Jake's performance had clearly affected his confidence. "Take your time, son," Colonel Roberts said kindly, recognizing the signs of demonstration nerves that could turn competent professionals into fumbling amateurs. We're here to see your best work, not your fastest work. Marcus nodded gratefully and began his assembly with the methodical precision of someone following a carefully rehearsed plan. His movements were correct but slightly mechanical, lacking the fluid grace that had characterized Jake's performance. Marcus was thinking too much, second-guessing decisions that should have been automatic, and his commentary was stilted rather than conversational. The N24 system requires careful attention to torque specifications. Marcus began, his voice slightly higher than normal. Precision Military Solutions has developed proprietary techniques for ensuring optimal performance across a range of environmental conditions. The words sounded rehearsed rather than natural, and Marcus's hands moved with the careful deliberation of someone afraid of making mistakes. The receiver assembly proceeded smoothly enough, but Marcus's explanations were overly technical and difficult to follow. He quoted specifications and engineering tolerances with mathematical precision, but failed to convey the practical understanding that had made Jake's demonstration so compelling. Marcus knew the theory perfectly, but seemed disconnected from the practical realities of actually using the weapon he was assembling. Tony Rodriguez watched Marcus's performance with the patient attention of someone who had mentored nervous soldiers through similar challenges. Marcus was competent, but overthinking every decision, turning a routine assembly into an exercise in anxiety management. Tony understood that Marcus's nervousness would probably cost him the contract, regardless of his technical skills. The bolt assembly gave Marcus particular trouble, not because he didn't know how to do it correctly, but because he was trying too hard to be perfect. His hands trembled slightly as he aligned components, and he had to restart one procedure when he realized he'd forgotten to explain his methodology to the evaluation panel. Marcus was technically proficient, but psychologically unprepared for the pressure of competitive demonstration. Rebecca Walsh felt genuine sympathy for Marcus's obvious discomfort, remembering her own early experiences with high-stakes evaluations. Everyone had to learn how to perform under pressure, and Marcus was discovering the hard way that technical knowledge alone wasn't sufficient for success in competitive environments. His performance was adequate but unremarkable, the kind of solid work that earned passing grades but didn't win contracts. Sarah Mitchell observed Marcus's struggles with the detached interest of someone studying a laboratory specimen. Marcus's nervousness was creating exactly the kind of opportunities that Sarah had been hoping to see, demonstrating that even technically competent contractors could be undermined by psychological pressure. The lesson was valuable, but Sarah showed no external reaction to Marcus's difficulties. Marcus's scope mounting procedure was textbook correct, but painfully slow. Every adjustment double-checked and triple-verified before being accepted as final. His explanations became increasingly technical as his nervousness grew, launching into detailed discussions of optical physics that were accurate, but largely irrelevant to the practical task at hand. Marcus was drowning in his own expertise, unable to distinguish between essential information and unnecessary detail. 28 minutes and 43 seconds after beginning his demonstration, Marcus Chun completed his assembly with obvious relief. His rifle was correctly assembled and would have functioned perfectly, but his performance had been forgettable rather than impressive. Marcus had proven his competence without demonstrating any particular excellence, exactly the kind of safe but uninspiring performance that rarely won competitive contracts. Tony Rodriguez approached the demonstration table with the unhurried confidence of someone who had nothing to prove to anyone. His gray hair and weathered hands told the story of decades spent working with military equipment under conditions that ranged from merely difficult to actively hostile. Tony didn't need to perform for the evaluation panel because his reputation had been earned through consistent excellence rather than spectacular demonstrations. "Afternoon, Colonel," Tony said with the easy familiarity of someone who had worked with military officers for most of his adult life. "Mind if I rearrange these components?" Old habits from field assembly, where parts don't always stay where you put them. Colonel Roberts nodded approvingly, recognizing the practical wisdom behind Tony's request. Field conditions were rarely as controlled as demonstration environments, and contractors who understood the difference between theory and reality were generally more reliable partners. Tony's approach suggested experience with actual military requirements rather than just theoretical knowledge. Tony's hands moved with the economical precision of someone who had performed similar tasks thousands of times under conditions where efficiency meant survival. His movements were unhurried but never wasteful, each action serving a specific purpose within the larger framework of weapon assembly. Tony worked like a craftsman rather than a performer, focused on results rather than presentation. The thing about the M24, Tony said as his hands worked, is that it's designed to be assembled by soldiers in the field, which means it has to be forgiving of less than perfect conditions. Contractors who focus too much on laboratory precision sometimes miss the practical realities of how these weapons actually get used. The subtle criticism of Marcus's overly theoretical approach was delivered without malice, but everyone in the room understood the implication. Tony Rodriguez had assembled weapons under enemy fire, in sandstorms, in rain, and in darkness. Tony understood that good enough under impossible conditions was better than perfect under ideal conditions. His bolt assembly procedure was different from both Jake's and Marcus's approaches, reflecting practical modifications developed through years of field experience. Tony's technique was faster but equally precise, eliminating unnecessary steps while maintaining all essential quality controls. His explanations were brief but comprehensive, conveying maximum information with minimum words. Rebecca Walsh recognized the authority in Tony's movements, the confidence that came from genuine expertise rather than careful preparation. Tony wasn't following a rehearsed procedure because he didn't need to follow a procedure at all. He was simply assembling a rifle the way he'd assembled thousands of rifles before, with the unconscious competence of someone for whom such tasks had become second nature. The scope mounting revealed Tony's particular expertise, his hands moving with the assurance of someone who had zeroed weapons under combat conditions. Tony's technique was slightly unorthodox but demonstrably effective, reflecting practical adaptations developed through years of real-world application. His explanations were targeted specifically at military requirements rather than civilian understanding. Scope alignment in the field is different from scope alignment on the range, Tony said as he made final adjustments. You're not looking for theoretical perfection, you're looking for practical accuracy that will hold up under stress. Sometimes that means accepting compromises that look wrong on paper, but work perfectly in practice. 19 minutes and 52 seconds after beginning his demonstration, Tony Rodriguez stepped back from a completed rifle that looked slightly different from the others, but would probably outperform them all under actual field conditions. Tony's assembly was faster than Jake's, more confident than Marcus's, and carried the authority of someone who understood military requirements at a level that couldn't be taught in civilian schools. Rebecca Walsh was called forward as the final scheduled presenter, and she approached the demonstration table with the controlled aggression of someone accustomed to proving herself in environments dominated by men. Rebecca's military experience was obvious in her posture, her movement, and her complete lack of nervousness about being evaluated by people whose approval she neither needed nor particularly wanted. "Colonel Roberts, Lieutenant Davis," Rebecca said with crisp military courtesy, her voice carrying just enough formality to remind everyone of her service record. "Advanced Tactical Solutions appreciates the opportunity to demonstrate our capabilities." Rebecca's approach to weapon assembly was distinctly different from her male competitors, reflecting training and experience gained under combat conditions where speed often mattered more than perfection. Her movements were aggressive but controlled, efficient but not reckless, and her commentary was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone explaining basic facts to people who might not understand them yet. The receiver assembly flowed under Rebecca's hands like water finding its natural course, each component sliding into place with the inevitability of gravity. Rebecca's technique was different from Tony's field-expedient approach and Jake's showroom perfection, reflecting training designed specifically for situations where weapons needed to be assembled quickly under stress. Combat assembly requires different priorities than demonstration assembly, Rebecca explained as her hands worked. In the field, you're not trying to impress evaluators. You're trying to put a functional weapon in the hands of someone who needs it immediately. That means emphasizing speed and reliability over theoretical perfection. Her bolt assembly was poetry in motion, hands moving with mechanical precision while her eyes remained fixed on the next set of components. Rebecca assembled weapons the way fighter pilots flew aircraft, with unconscious competence developed through repetitive training under increasingly difficult conditions. Her muscle memory was so deeply ingrained that she could probably assemble an M24 in complete darkness. Sarah Mitchell watched Rebecca's performance with the focused attention of someone recognizing a kindred spirit. Rebecca's technique was different from Sarah's own approach, but the underlying confidence was familiar. Rebecca assembled weapons like someone who had done it when her life depended on getting it right, and that kind of experience left permanent marks on how you approached any similar task. The scope mounting procedure revealed Rebecca's particular expertise in practical accuracy rather than theoretical precision. Her adjustments were made quickly, but with obvious knowledge of exactly what each change would accomplish. Rebecca's explanations were targeted at people who would actually use the weapon rather than people who would merely evaluate its assembly. Military scopes need to maintain zero through conditions that would destroy civilian equipment, Rebecca said as she made final adjustments. Proper mounting isn't about achieving perfect alignment in controlled conditions. It's about maintaining acceptable alignment through temperature changes, vibration, impact, and environmental contamination. 17 minutes and 23 seconds after beginning her demonstration, Rebecca Walsh stepped back from a completed rifle that looked like it was ready for immediate deployment. Her assembly was the fastest yet, but her technique suggested that she could have gone even faster if necessary. Rebecca had demonstrated not just competence, but the kind of unconscious expertise that could only be developed through extensive practical experience. Colonel Roberts made his final notes while Lieutenant Davis recorded Rebecca's time and performance observations. 4 demonstrations had been completed, each reflecting different approaches to the same fundamental task. Jake Harrison had combined technical excellence with professional presentation. Marcus Chun had demonstrated theoretical knowledge undermined by performance anxiety. Tony Rodriguez had shown the practical wisdom of extensive field experience. Rebecca Walsh had displayed the aggressive competence of someone trained for combat conditions. And now it was Sarah Mitchell's turn. Sarah Mitchell rose from her folding chair with the deliberate movement of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment for 18 months. The nervous energy that had characterized her behavior all morning seemed to evaporate as she walked toward the demonstration table, replaced by something that the other contractors couldn't quite identify, but found vaguely unsettling. Her floral dress still looked like it belonged at a church social rather than a military facility, but her posture had shifted in a way that suggested hidden depths beneath the suburban exterior. The assembly hall fell into the kind of expectant silence that accompanies moments when everyone knows they're about to witness something significant, even if they can't predict exactly what form that significance will take. Jake Harrison leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, wearing the indulgent smile of someone preparing to watch an amateur embarrass herself. Marcus Chen fidgeted with his presentation materials, grateful that his own mediocre performance would soon be overshadowed by something truly catastrophic. Tony Rodriguez studied Sarah with the careful attention of someone who had learned to recognize danger in unexpected packages. Rebecca Walsh watched with professional curiosity, wondering how quickly this would become painful to observe. Colonel. Roberts checked his watch and noted that Sarah had exactly 30 minutes to demonstrate her company's capabilities, the same time allocation that had been provided to every other contractor. Lieutenant Davis prepared his stopwatch and video, recording the equipment with the mechanical precision of someone who documented everything regardless of how spectacular or mundane it might prove to be. The evaluation criteria remained the same for Sarah as they had been for everyone else, though everyone in the room assumed that her performance would be evaluated more for effort than for results. Sarah approached the demonstration table where the disassembled M24 lay, waiting like a challenge that had defeated better contractors than her. The weapon components were arranged exactly as they had been for each previous demonstration, positioned according to military specifications that prioritized organization over convenience. The morning's earlier demonstrations had left faint impressions in the padding beneath certain components, ghostly evidence of the professional hands that had assembled and disassembled this particular rifle multiple times already. "Mrs. Mitchell," Colonel Roberts said with the formal courtesy that military officers reserve for civilians who found themselves in situations beyond their expertise. "Please take your time and demonstrate your company's approach to weapons maintenance and assembly. Remember that we're evaluating both technical competence and practical methodology." Sarah nodded without speaking and moved to stand beside the demonstration table. Her hands hung loosely at her sides, and for a moment she simply stared at the disassembled weapon with an expression that might have been contemplation or might have been terror. The other contractors exchanged glances that ranged from sympathetic to anticipatory, waiting for the inevitable moment when Sarah would realize she was in over her head and withdraw gracefully from competition. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't contemplating the complexity of the task ahead of her. She was remembering. She was remembering the weight of an M24 in her hands at Fort Bragg 23 years ago, when she had been Sergeant Sarah Chun of the 82nd Airborne Division and one of only 12 women selected for the Army's experimental female sniper program. She was remembering the satisfying click of precision components finding their designated positions, the mechanical poetry of a weapon system designed by engineers who understood that soldiers' lives depended on reliable equipment. She was remembering the countless hours she had spent learning to assemble, disassemble, clean, repair, and maintain weapons under every conceivable condition from desert heat to Arctic cold. Most of all, she was remembering why she had walked away from all of it. Sarah's hands moved to the rifle components with sudden decisiveness, and Lieutenant Davis clicked his stopwatch to begin the official timing. But something was wrong with Sarah's movements, something that made Jake Harrison's confident smile falter slightly and caused Tony Rodriguez to straighten from his casual lean against the wall. Sarah's hands didn't fumble or hesitate as everyone expected. Instead, they moved with the fluid precision of someone for whom weapon assembly was as natural as breathing. The receiver came up in Sarah's left hand while her right hand reached for the bolt assembly, both movements occurring simultaneously. In a display of ambidextrous coordination that spoke of extensive training rather than nervous enthusiasm, Sarah's fingers found contact points and alignment guides with the unconscious accuracy of muscle memory, and her movements flowed together in a seamless sequence that was fundamentally different from anything the other contractors had demonstrated. Rebecca Walsh felt something cold settle in her stomach as she recognized what she was seeing. Sarah Mitchell wasn't learning how to assemble an M24 rifle. Sarah Mitchell was remembering how to assemble an M24 rifle, and the difference was profound enough to change everything about the evaluation that was supposedly taking place. "Stock alignment is critical for accuracy," Sarah said quietly, her voice taking on a different quality as her hands worked. But most civilian contractors focus on theoretical precision rather than practical reliability. Field conditions require adaptations that laboratory specifications don't account for. Her explanation was delivered with casual authority, the tone of someone sharing expertise rather than demonstrating knowledge. The bolt slid into the receiver with mechanical precision, Sarah's fingers manipulating springs and pins with the confidence of someone who had performed this exact sequence thousands of times under conditions where failure meant death rather than embarrassment. Her movements were economical to the point of appearing effortless, each action flowing naturally into the next without pause or hesitation. Marcus Chun stared at Sarah's hands with growing confusion, unable to reconcile what he was seeing with his assumptions about who Sarah Mitchell was supposed to be. The nervous housewife who had apologized for being late was assembling a military sniper rifle with the casual competence of someone for whom such tasks were routine rather than challenging. Marcus found himself taking mental notes on Sarah's technique, recognizing innovations and efficiencies that he had never considered. The trigger mechanism required delicate handling, and Sarah's approach differed significantly from the methods demonstrated by the other contractors. Where they had worked with careful deliberation, Sarah moved with aggressive confidence, her fingers dancing across components with the precision of a surgical procedure performed by someone who had done it so many times that conscious thought was no longer required. Military trigger specifications are designed around worst-case scenarios, Sarah explained as her hands worked, never slowing or pausing in their mechanical ballet. Contractors who optimize for ideal conditions often produce weapons that fail when soldiers need them most. Real-world reliability requires understanding the difference between engineering perfection and combat effectiveness. Jake Harrison found himself leaning forward despite his skepticism, drawn by something in Sarah's technique that he couldn't quite identify, but definitely recognized as significant. Sarah's assembly method was different from his own carefully perfected approach, incorporating modifications and shortcuts that suggested extensive practical experience rather than theoretical training. Jake was beginning to suspect that Sarah Mitchell was not who she appeared to be. The barrel assembly presented the greatest challenge in any M24 reconstruction, requiring precise alignment and careful handling of components that were calibrated to tolerances measured in thousandths of inches. Sarah lifted the barrel with the reverent care of someone who understood that military sniper rifles were precision instruments rather than simple tools, but her movements remained fluid and confident rather than tentative and worried. Colonel Roberts made careful notes on his evaluation form, but his attention was increasingly focused on Sarah's technique rather than her timing. 23 years of evaluating military contractors had taught him to recognize genuine expertise, and what he was observing from Sarah Mitchell bore all the hallmarks of someone with extensive hands-on experience rather than academic knowledge. Sarah's scope mounting procedure was revelation disguised as routine maintenance. Her hands moved across the optical components with the familiarity of someone who had zeroed weapons under every conceivable condition, making adjustments that reflected practical understanding rather than theoretical knowledge. Her explanations were targeted at people who would actually use the weapon, rather than people who would merely evaluate its assembly. Scope alignment under field conditions requires compensating for factors that don't exist in controlled environments, Sarah said as she made final adjustments with movements so small they were barely visible. Temperature variations, humidity changes, and mechanical stress all affect optical performance in ways that laboratory testing can't replicate. Real accuracy comes from understanding how weapons behave under stress rather than how they perform under ideal conditions. Lieutenant Davis watched his stopwatch with growing amazement as Sarah's assembly time approached marks that should have been impossible for someone without extensive military training. Sarah wasn't just assembling the rifle correctly. She was assembling it faster than any of the professional contractors who had preceded her, and her technique suggested that she could probably go even faster if necessary. Tony Rodriguez studied Sarah's movements with the recognition of someone identifying a fellow professional. Sarah's technique bore the unmistakable signatures of military training, not the kind of basic instruction that might be provided to civilian contractors, but The intensive, repetitive drilling that produced soldiers capable of maintaining their equipment under combat conditions. Tony was beginning to understand that Sarah Mitchell represented something entirely different from what everyone had assumed. The final components came together under Sarah's hands with the inevitability of a well-designed machine finding its natural configuration. Every part slid into its designated position with mechanical precision. Every adjustment was made with confident authority, and every movement reflected the kind of unconscious competence that could only be developed through extensive practical experience. Sarah performed a final function check with movements so automatic they appeared choreographed, cycling the bolt and testing the trigger mechanism with the systematic thoroughness of someone for whom weapon safety was a matter of ingrained habit, rather than conscious procedure. Her inspection was brief but comprehensive, covering every critical system with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what to look for and how to find it. 14 minutes and 37 seconds after touching the first component, Sarah Mitchell stepped back from the demonstration table with a completed M24 rifle in her hands. The weapon looked exactly as it should, every component properly positioned and secured, every adjustment made to specifications that exceeded military requirements. But Sarah's assembly time was faster than Jake Harrison's, significantly faster than Marcus Chun's, faster than Tony Rodriguez's field expedient approach, and even faster than Rebecca Walsh's combat-trained efficiency. The assembly hall fell into complete silence as the implications of what everyone had just witnessed settled into their collective consciousness. Sarah Mitchell had not merely assembled a military sniper rifle correctly. She had assembled it faster and with greater apparent competence than any of the professional contractors who had competed against her. The nervous housewife who had apologized for being late had just demonstrated a level of technical expertise that suggested extensive military training rather than amateur enthusiasm. Colonel Roberts stared at his evaluation form with the expression of someone whose fundamental assumptions about reality had just been challenged by incontrovertible evidence. Lieutenant Davis checked his stopwatch multiple times, unable to believe that the timing could possibly be correct. Marcus Chun sat down heavily in the nearest chair, his face pale with the realization that he had been thoroughly outclassed by someone he had dismissed as incompetent. Jake Harrison's confident smile had vanished entirely, replaced by the careful attention of someone who had just discovered that the game he thought he was playing had different rules than he understood. Rebecca Walsh approached the demonstration table with the slow movement of someone examining evidence of impossible events. She studied the assembled rifle with professional attention, looking for signs of corner cutting or sloppy workmanship. That might explain Sarah's impossible performance. But the weapon was perfectly assembled, every component properly positioned and secured, every adjustment made with precision that met or exceeded military specifications. Questions? Sarah asked quietly, her voice carrying the same soft tone she had used all morning, but somehow conveying an entirely different message. The nervous energy that had characterized her earlier behavior had vanished completely, replaced by the calm confidence of someone who had just demonstrated exactly what she was capable of when circumstances required it. Colonel Roberts found his voice first, though it took him several seconds to formulate an appropriate response. "Mrs. Mitchell, that was quite an impressive demonstration. Your technique suggests considerably more experience than your company profile indicated. Would you mind explaining where you acquired your expertise with military weapon systems?" Sarah Mitchell looked around the assembly hall at the faces of people who had spent the morning dismissing her as an amateur playing at a profession she didn't understand. Jake Harrison's arrogance had been replaced by wary respect. Marcus Chun's nervous superiority had transformed into obvious embarrassment. Tony Rodriguez was studying her with the careful attention of someone recognizing a fellow professional. Rebecca Walsh was examining the assembled rifle with growing amazement. "My name is Sarah Mitchell now," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent room with perfect clarity. But for 8 years, I was Sergeant Sarah Chun, 82nd Airborne Division, United States Army. I was selected for the Experimental Female Sniper Program in 1999, graduated second in my class from the Army Marksmanship Unit, and spent 3 tours in Afghanistan as a designated marksman before transferring to weapons maintenance and training duties. The revelation hit the room like a physical force, recontextualizing everything that had occurred during the morning's evaluations. Sarah Mitchell wasn't a grieving widow trying to honor her husband's memory by continuing his business. Sarah Mitchell was a retired military professional who had allowed everyone to assume she was something else entirely. And the assumption had been so complete that no one had bothered to look beyond surface appearances. I left the Army in 2007, Sarah continued, her voice taking on the matter-of-fact tone of someone reciting biographical information. Married David Mitchell, started a family, and spent 15 years as what you would call a housewife. David handled the business side of Mitchell Defense Solutions while I raised our children and maintained our household. But David was never the technical expert that our marketing materials suggested. The engineering innovations, the maintenance protocols, the quality control procedures that built our reputation came from me. Lieutenant Davis stared at Sarah with the expression of someone whose understanding of reality had just been fundamentally revised. The nervous woman who had fumbled with her visitor's badge was actually a decorated combat veteran with more practical experience than any of the contractors she had been competing against. The apologetic housewife who had asked permission to sit in an unmarked chair was actually the technical force behind one of the most respected names in military contracting. David died 18 months ago, Sarah said, her voice softening slightly as she touched on painful personal history. Our client list evaporated because everyone assumed that David had been the source of our technical expertise. Banks questioned our loan applications, suppliers demanded cash payments, and potential customers stopped returning our calls. I realized that Mitchell Defense Solutions would only survive if I could prove that our capabilities hadn't died with David. Rebecca Walsh felt a surge of professional respect for Sarah that was entirely separate from her amazement at the morning's demonstration. Sarah had allowed herself to be dismissed and mocked because it served her strategic purposes, enduring humiliation and condescension in service of a larger goal. The strength required for such a performance was impressive in ways that had nothing to do with weapon assembly. I requested the final demonstration slot, Sarah continued, because I wanted to see what I was competing against before revealing my actual capabilities. I needed to understand how fast I had to be to make an impression that no one could dismiss or explain away. 14 minutes and 37 seconds was fast enough to demonstrate that Mitchell Defense Solutions remains capable of exceeding any reasonable standard of technical excellence. Jake Harrison found himself recalculating everything he thought he knew about the competitive landscape for military contracting. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just another contractor seeking a share of available business. Sarah Mitchell was a legitimate threat to his established dominance, someone whose combination of technical expertise and strategic thinking made her dangerous in ways he was only beginning to understand. Tony Rodriguez stepped forward with the slow movement of someone approaching a fellow professional whose credentials had just been established beyond any possible doubt. "Sergeant Chun," he said with genuine respect, using Sarah's military rank rather than her civilian title. "That was some of the finest weapons work I've seen in 20 years of contracting. Your technique incorporates modifications I've never considered, and your timing was exceptional, even by military standards." Sarah nodded acknowledgement of Tony's professional respect while maintaining the composed demeanor of someone who had achieved exactly what she intended to achieve. "Thank you, Tony. Your own demonstration showed exactly the kind of field expedient thinking that separates real soldiers from weekend warriors. I learned some things from watching your approach that I'll probably incorporate into my own procedures." The exchange between Sarah and Tony carried the weight of mutual recognition between professionals who had earned their expertise under conditions where failure had consequences more serious than lost contracts. Their conversation excluded everyone else in the room, not through deliberate rudeness, but through the simple reality that they were discussing experiences and knowledge that could only be acquired through military service. Colonel Roberts cleared his throat to regain control of an evaluation session that had transformed into something entirely different from what he had planned. "Mrs. Mitchell, I believe we have sufficient information to complete our assessment of your company's capabilities. Thank you for a most enlightening demonstration." Sarah smiled with genuine warmth for the first time all morning, the expression transforming her face from nervous apprehension to confident satisfaction. "Thank you for the opportunity, Colonel Roberts. I believe Mitchell Defense Solutions has demonstrated that reports of our technical decline have been greatly exaggerated." The assembly hall buzzed with quiet conversations as contractors processed the implications of what they had witnessed. Sarah Mitchell had not merely won the morning's competition. She had redefined what winning meant by demonstrating capabilities that exceeded everyone else's best efforts. The nervous housewife who had apologized for being late had revealed herself to be the most technically competent person in the room, and her transformation had been so complete that it felt like witnessing a magic trick performed by someone who had spent years perfecting the illusion. Marcus Chun approached Sarah with the hesitant movement of someone seeking to make amends for earlier assumptions that now seemed embarrassingly misguided. "Mrs. Mitchell, I owe you an apology for my earlier comments about courage and continuing your husband's work. I had no idea that you were the technical force behind Mitchell Defense Solutions." Sarah accepted Marcus's apology with gracious professionalism, understanding that his assumptions had been natural given the information he had been provided. "No apology necessary, Marcus. I deliberately encouraged those assumptions because they served my strategic purposes. Sometimes the most effective approach is to let people underestimate you until the moment when their underestimation becomes your advantage." The lesson was delivered without malice, but with unmistakable authority, the kind of strategic wisdom that could only be learned through extensive experience with competitive situations where psychological warfare was as important as technical competence. Sarah had played a longer game than anyone else in the room had realized, and her victory was as much about strategic thinking as it was about technical excellence. Jake Harrison stood apart from the group conversations, processing the reality that his 8-year dominance of military contracting had just been challenged by someone whose capabilities he had never suspected existed. Sarah Mitchell represented a threat to his established business model that was both immediate and long-term. Someone whose combination of technical expertise and strategic intelligence made her formidable in ways that went far beyond simple weapon assembly. But perhaps more troubling than the competitive threat was the realization that Jake's assumptions about people and situations were not as reliable as he had believed. Sarah Mitchell had been sitting in the same room with him all morning, and he had never suspected that she represented anything more than token competition. If he could be wrong about someone so completely, what else might he be wrong about? Rebecca Walsh found herself genuinely impressed by Sarah's performance in ways that had nothing to do with professional rivalry. Sarah had endured mockery and condescension for hours without breaking character, maintaining her cover identity until the moment when revelation would have maximum impact. The discipline required for such a performance was remarkable, and Rebecca recognized it as evidence of military training that went far beyond basic weapons proficiency. "Outstanding work, Sergeant," Rebecca said with genuine respect, approaching Sarah with the easy camaraderie of one soldier acknowledging another. "Your cover was perfect, and your timing was flawless. I completely bought the nervous housewife routine right up until the moment your hands touched that rifle." Sarah smiled with appreciation for Rebecca's professional recognition, understanding that praise from someone with Rebecca's combat experience carried weight that civilian approval could never match. Thank you, Rebecca. Your own demonstration was impressive, especially your adaptation of combat assembly techniques for evaluation purposes. It's clear that your military experience translates well to civilian contracting. The conversation between the two women carried undertones of mutual respect that reflected shared experiences in military environments dominated by men who often questioned women's capabilities. Both Sarah and Rebecca had proven themselves in situations where failure meant more than professional embarrassment, and their recognition of each other's competence was immediate and complete. Lieutenant Davis approached Sarah with evaluation forms that would need to be updated to reflect her actual qualifications rather than the fictional background that had been provided in her initial application. Mrs. Mitchell, we'll need to revise our documentation to accurately reflect your military service and technical expertise. Your initial application materials were somewhat incomplete regarding your professional background. Sarah nodded understanding of the administrative requirements while maintaining the amused expression of someone who had successfully executed a complex deception. Of course, Lieutenant. I'll provide complete military service records and technical certifications for your files. I think you'll find that Mitchell Defense Solutions qualifications are somewhat more extensive than your initial assessment indicated. The bureaucratic language couldn't disguise the reality that Sarah had deliberately misrepresented her capabilities in order to create exactly the kind of dramatic revelation that would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. Her strategy had been calculated to maximize psychological impact rather than simply demonstrate technical competence, and the approach had succeeded beyond anything that straightforward honesty could have achieved. Colonel Roberts studied his evaluation forms with the expression of someone whose decision-making process had been fundamentally altered by new information. Sarah Mitchell's demonstration had not merely been technically superior to her competitors. It had been so dramatically superior that it called into question the validity of the entire evaluation process. How could someone with her obvious expertise have been initially dismissed as unqualified for consideration? The answer, of course, was that assumptions about people's capabilities were often based on superficial characteristics rather than actual qualifications, and Sarah had deliberately exploited those assumptions to create the conditions for her strategic revelation. Her success was as much about understanding human psychology as it was about understanding weapon systems, and the combination made her formidable in ways that pure technical competence could never achieve. The morning's evaluation had transformed from a routine contractor assessment into something approaching performance art, with Sarah Mitchell as both director and star performer in a production designed to challenge everyone's assumptions about competence, expertise, and the relationship between appearance and reality. Her victory was complete, not merely because she had demonstrated superior technical skills, but because she had forced everyone present to confront their own biases and preconceptions. And as the assembly hall slowly returned to normal activity, Sarah Mitchell stood quietly beside her perfectly assembled rifle, wearing her floral dress and her gentle smile, looking exactly like the housewife everyone had assumed her to be. The transformation was complete, but now everyone understood that appearances could be the most effective camouflage of all. The immediate aftermath of Sarah's revelation created a peculiar atmosphere in the assembly hall, as if the very air had been charged with electricity that made normal conversation feel inadequate to the moment. The fluorescent lights continued their steady hum. The Virginia humidity pressed against the windows with unchanged persistence, and the disassembled weapons on nearby tables remained exactly where they had been placed. Yet everything felt different, transformed by the knowledge that assumptions everyone had considered reliable had proven to be elaborate fiction. Colonel Roberts found himself in the unusual position of needing to recalibrate an evaluation process that had been designed around completely different parameters than what he was now confronting. Sarah Mitchell's demonstration had not merely exceeded expectations, It had shattered the conceptual framework within which those expectations had been formed. Military procurement procedures were built on predictable relationships between credentials, experience, and performance, but Sarah had deliberately disrupted those relationships to create strategic advantage. Lieutenant Davis struggled with documentation challenges that his training had never prepared him to handle. Sarah's initial application materials had been technically accurate but strategically incomplete, providing enough information to qualify for consideration, while concealing the depth of expertise that made her the most qualified candidate in the room. The bureaucratic systems designed to ensure fair evaluation had been manipulated by someone who understood exactly how those systems functioned and where their vulnerabilities lay. Jake Harrison stood near the coffee station with the careful stillness of someone processing information that threatened fundamental assumptions about his professional identity. For 8 years, Harrison Defense Technologies had dominated military contracting through a combination of technical competence and strategic positioning that had seemed unassailable. Jake's confidence had been built on the belief that he understood the competitive landscape better than anyone else, that his experience gave him advantages that newer contractors couldn't match. But Sarah Mitchell had demonstrated that experience could be hidden as effectively as it could be displayed, that strategic deception could be more powerful than honest self-promotion, and that the competitive landscape contained threats that couldn't be identified through conventional analysis. Jake's worldview was experiencing the kind of fundamental revision that successful people rarely encountered and never enjoyed. Marcus Chun had retreated to a corner of the assembly hall where he could observe the ongoing conversations without being required to participate in them. His morning had begun with nervous confidence in his technical abilities and ended with the humbling realization that technical abilities alone were insufficient for success in environments where strategic thinking mattered as much as procedural knowledge. Marcus was discovering that professional competence was more complex and multifaceted than his academic training had suggested. The comparison between his own methodical but uninspired performance and Sarah's strategic masterpiece was painful, in ways that went beyond simple competitive disappointment. Marcus had approached the morning's evaluation as a technical challenge to be solved through careful preparation and flawless execution, but Sarah had treated it as a psychological operation, designed to achieve objectives that transcended mere demonstration of capability. Tony Rodriguez moved through the assembly hall with the easy confidence of someone whose professional reputation remained intact regardless of the morning's unexpected developments. Tony's performance had been solid and competent, reflecting decades of experience that couldn't be diminished by someone else's superior demonstration. But Tony was also experienced enough to recognize strategic brilliance when he encountered it, and Sarah's approach had been strategic brilliance of the highest order. Tony understood that Sarah's victory was about more than weapon assembly speed or technical precision. Sarah had identified the psychological dynamics that governed competitive evaluation, developed a strategy to exploit those dynamics, and executed that strategy with patience and discipline that spoke to military training at levels far beyond basic proficiency. Tony respected strategic thinking because he had learned through bitter experience that technical competence without strategic awareness was a formula for failure in environments where survival depended on understanding human nature as much as understanding equipment. Rebecca Walsh found herself experiencing professional admiration that was complicated by personal recognition of what Sarah's performance had cost in terms of emotional endurance. Rebecca had served in military environments where maintaining cover identities was a matter of operational security, and she understood the psychological toll of sustaining false personas under hostile scrutiny. Sarah had endured hours of condescension and mockery while maintaining perfect character discipline, never allowing her cover to slip even when provoked by comments that must have been personally offensive. The strength required for such a performance went far beyond technical proficiency or strategic intelligence. Sarah had demonstrated the kind of psychological resilience that could only be developed through extensive experience with high-stakes situations where failure had consequences more serious than professional embarrassment. Rebecca recognized the signs because she had developed similar resilience through her own military service, but she doubted she could have sustained Sarah's performance for as long or as completely. Sarah herself remained near the demonstration table, accepting congratulations and answering questions with the gracious professionalism of someone who had achieved exactly what she intended to achieve. Her floral dress and gentle demeanor remained unchanged, but the context within which those characteristics were interpreted had been fundamentally altered. The nervous housewife had been revealed as strategic camouflage worn by someone whose actual capabilities far exceeded anything suggested by surface appearances. But Sarah's satisfaction with her performance was tempered by awareness that her victory had come at a cost that extended beyond the immediate competitive situation. She had been forced to endure mockery and condescension that had been genuinely painful, allowing people to dismiss her as incompetent in ways that contradicted everything she knew about her own abilities. The strategy had been necessary and successful, but it had required sacrifices that would have long-term psychological consequences. Colonel Roberts approached Sarah with evaluation forms that would need to be completely rewritten to reflect accurate information about her qualifications and experience. "Mrs. Mitchell, I believe we have sufficient information to complete our assessment, but I'd like to understand your strategic thinking behind this morning's presentation. Your approach was highly unconventional, and I'm curious about your reasoning." Sarah smiled with genuine warmth, appreciating the colonel's professional interest in her methodology rather than simply her results. "Colonel, military contracting has become increasingly dominated by companies that emphasize marketing over substance, presentation over performance. I realized that Mitchell Defense Solutions would need to demonstrate capabilities that couldn't be dismissed or explained away through conventional evaluation criteria." The explanation was delivered with matter-of-fact directness, but it contained implications that extended far beyond the immediate competitive situation. Sarah was suggesting that the entire military contracting industry had become corrupted by emphasis on appearance over substance, that evaluation processes had become vulnerable to manipulation by companies that understood presentation better than they understood actual military requirements. "I spent 18 months watching potential clients dismiss Mitchell Defense Solutions because they assumed our technical expertise had died with my husband," Sarah continued, her voice taking on the harder edge of someone recounting professional frustrations that had threatened everything she had worked to build. Phone calls weren't returned, meetings were canceled, and contracts were awarded to companies whose capabilities were demonstrably inferior to ours. Lieutenant Davis listened with growing understanding of the strategic pressures that had shaped Sarah's approach to the morning's evaluation. Military contracting was supposed to be a merit-based system where technical competence determined success, but Sarah's experience suggested that perception often mattered more than reality, that assumptions about people's capabilities could override objective evidence of actual performance. I realized that conventional self-promotion would be insufficient to overcome the assumptions people had formed about Mitchell Defense Solutions, Sarah said, her explanation taking on the analytical tone of someone describing a complex problem that had required an equally complex solution. Direct contradiction of those assumptions would have been dismissed as desperate marketing, but dramatic demonstration of capabilities that exceeded everyone's expectations would be impossible to ignore or rationalize away. Jake Harrison found himself genuinely impressed by the sophistication of Sarah's strategic thinking, even as he recognized that her success represented a serious threat to his own business interests. Sarah had identified weaknesses in evaluation systems that Jake had never considered, developed countermeasures that exploited psychological biases he hadn't known existed, and executed a strategy that had transformed disadvantage into decisive advantage. But Jake was also beginning to understand that Sarah's approach had implications that extended beyond the immediate competitive situation. If evaluation systems were as vulnerable to manipulation as Sarah had demonstrated, then the entire foundation of competitive contracting might be less reliable than everyone assumed. Jake's confidence in his own success was being undermined not just by Sarah's superior performance, but by recognition that his understanding of how success was achieved might be fundamentally flawed. Marcus Chun approached Sarah with the hesitant manner of someone seeking guidance from a superior practitioner. "Mrs. Mitchell, would you be willing to share some insights about strategic thinking in competitive environments? I'm beginning to realize that my approach to professional development has been focused too narrowly on technical skills." Sarah's response reflected genuine interest in mentoring younger professionals, understanding that Marcus's request represented recognition of learning opportunities rather than simple curiosity. "Marcus, technical competence is necessary, but not sufficient for success in environments where human psychology determines outcomes as much as objective performance. Understanding how people form assumptions, how those assumptions influence decision-making, and how strategic presentation can shape perception is as important as understanding how equipment functions." The advice was delivered with the authority of someone whose strategic thinking had just been validated through dramatic practical success, but it also reflected genuine concern for Marcus's professional development. Sarah understood that Marcus possessed solid technical foundations that could support strategic sophistication if properly developed, and she was willing to share insights that might help him avoid similar competitive disadvantages in the future. Tony Rodriguez joined the conversation with observations that reflected his own extensive experience with the political dimensions of military contracting. "Sarah's right about the importance of strategic thinking, but I'd add that understanding institutional culture is equally critical. Military organizations have their own internal dynamics that can't be learned from textbooks or training programs." The three-way conversation that developed between Sarah, Marcus, and Tony reflected the kind of professional mentorship that occurred when experienced practitioners recognized potential in younger colleagues. Sarah's demonstration had established her credibility beyond any possible doubt, but her willingness to share strategic insights revealed character qualities that went beyond competitive excellence. Rebecca Walsh observed the mentoring conversation with appreciation for the professional generosity it represented, understanding that Sarah's willingness to educate potential competitors reflected confidence in her own capabilities that couldn't be threatened by others' improvement. Military culture emphasized the importance of developing subordinates and sharing expertise, and Sarah was demonstrating that those values had survived her transition to civilian contracting. Colonel Roberts completed his evaluation forms with the satisfaction of someone whose assessment process had produced exactly the kind of clarity that military procurement procedures were designed to achieve. Sarah Mitchell's demonstration had eliminated any possible ambiguity about technical capabilities, strategic sophistication, and professional qualifications. The decision-making process that had seemed complex at the beginning of the morning had become straightforward through Sarah's dramatic elimination of uncertainty. Lieutenant Davis reviewed his documentation with appreciation for the completeness of information that Sarah's revelation had provided. Military bureaucracy functioned best when supplied with comprehensive data about contractors' qualifications and capabilities, and Sarah's full disclosure of her background had transformed incomplete application materials into a robust foundation for institutional decision-making. The assembly hall gradually returned to normal activity as contractors gathered their materials and prepared to depart, but the atmosphere remained charged with recognition that the morning's events had been extraordinary rather than routine. Sarah Mitchell's performance would be discussed and analyzed for years to come, serving as a case study in strategic thinking that transcended the immediate competitive situation. Jake Harrison approached Sarah with the careful respect of someone acknowledging a superior competitor while maintaining his own professional dignity. "Mrs. Mitchell, that was remarkable work this morning. I've been doing this for 8 years, and I've never seen anything quite like your approach. Harrison Defense Technologies would be honored to explore potential collaboration opportunities if you're interested in discussing partnership arrangements." The offer reflected genuine recognition of Sarah's capabilities combined with pragmatic understanding that cooperation might be preferable to continued competition against someone whose strategic sophistication had proven superior to his own. Jake was experienced enough to recognize when strategic repositioning was necessary, and Sarah's demonstration had created exactly those circumstances. Sarah considered Jake's proposal with the careful attention of someone evaluating potential business relationships based on strategic value rather than personal preference. "Jake, I appreciate the offer, and I'm certainly open to discussing mutually beneficial arrangements. Mitchell Defense Solutions has capabilities that might complement Harrison Defense Technologies' established market position." The diplomatic response reflected Sarah's understanding that sustainable success in military contracting required building networks of professional relationships rather than simply winning individual competitions. Sarah's morning victory had established her credibility, but long-term success would depend on her ability to translate that credibility into ongoing business relationships that could survive changes in competitive circumstances. Marcus Chun gathered his presentation materials with the thoughtful demeanor of someone whose professional education had been significantly advanced through unexpected learning opportunities. Marcus's morning had been humbling in ways that were ultimately constructive, providing insights into competitive dynamics that couldn't be acquired through academic study or routine professional experience. Tony Rodriguez prepared to depart with the satisfied expression of someone whose professional reputation had been enhanced rather than diminished by association with exceptional performers. Tony's solid demonstration had been overshadowed by Sarah's strategic masterpiece, but his gracious response to being outperformed had reinforced his reputation for professional maturity that was valuable in its own right. Rebecca Walsh approached Sarah with contact information and suggestions for future collaboration opportunities that reflected mutual respect between military professionals who had successfully transitioned to civilian careers. Sarah, Advanced Tactical Solutions, would be interested in exploring subcontracting arrangements that could utilize Mitchell Defense Solutions' technical expertise on larger contracts. The offer represented recognition that Sarah's capabilities could enhance Rebecca's own competitive position while providing Mitchell Defense Solutions with business opportunities that might not otherwise be available. Military professionals understood the value of strategic alliances that leveraged complementary strengths rather than competing directly across all capabilities. Colonel Roberts announced his preliminary decision with the formal authority of someone whose judgment carried institutional weight that extended far beyond the immediate contracting opportunity. "Based on this morning's demonstrations, I'm recommending that Mitchell Defense Solutions be awarded the primary weapons maintenance contract, with provisions for subcontracting arrangements that utilize the specialized capabilities of other qualified firms." The decision reflected strategic thinking that recognized Sarah's superior demonstration, while creating opportunities for other contractors to participate in the overall project through collaborative arrangements. Military procurement procedures were designed to optimize institutional capabilities rather than simply reward individual excellence, and Colonel Roberts' approach reflected understanding of those broader objectives. Lieutenant Davis documented the final evaluations with appreciation for the clarity that Sarah's demonstration had brought to what had initially appeared to be a complex competitive situation. Military bureaucracy functioned most effectively when decision-making criteria were unambiguous, and Sarah's performance had eliminated any possible uncertainty about relative capabilities among the competing contractors. Sarah accepted the preliminary contract award with gracious professionalism that reflected understanding of the responsibilities that accompanied such recognition. Colonel Roberts, Mitchell Defense Solutions is honored by your confidence, and we're committed to delivering performance that exceeds your expectations. We look forward to working with qualified subcontractors to ensure comprehensive coverage of all project requirements. The acceptance speech was brief, but comprehensive, acknowledging both the honor of selection and the practical requirements of successful contract execution. Sarah understood that winning the competition was only the beginning of a process that would require sustained excellent performance over the 3-year contract duration. As contractors began departing the assembly hall, conversations continued with the animated energy of people who had witnessed something genuinely extraordinary. Sarah Mitchell's transformation from dismissed housewife to respected professional would be remembered and discussed long after the immediate contracting decision had been implemented and the specific technical demonstrations had been forgotten. The morning's events had demonstrated that assumptions about people's capabilities were often based on superficial characteristics rather than actual qualifications, that strategic thinking could be more powerful than conventional self-promotion, and that patience and discipline could transform apparent disadvantages into decisive advantages. Sarah's victory was complete not merely because she had won a lucrative contract, but because she had challenged everyone present to reconsider their assumptions about competence, expertise, and the relationship between appearance and reality. Sarah remained in the assembly hall after the other contractors had departed, standing quietly beside the demonstration table where her perfectly assembled M24 rifle reflected the fluorescent lighting with metallic precision. Her floral dress and gentle demeanor remained unchanged from the morning's beginning, but the context within which those characteristics were interpreted had been fundamentally transformed. The nervous housewife had been revealed as strategic, camouflage worn by someone whose actual capabilities far exceeded anything suggested by surface appearances. Sarah Mitchell had proven that the most dangerous weapon was often the one nobody saw coming, that strength could hide behind the gentlest smile, and that the person everyone dismissed might be the one who had been waiting for exactly the right moment to remind the world who they really were. Colonel Roberts approached Sarah with final paperwork that would formalize the contract award and establish the legal framework for the 3-year collaboration between Mitchell Defense Solutions and the United States Army. Mrs. Mitchell, this has been one of the most memorable contractor evaluations I've overseen in 15 years of military procurement. Your demonstration will be studied and discussed for years to come. Sarah smiled with quiet satisfaction, appreciating recognition that transcended the immediate business success to acknowledge the broader implications of her strategic approach. Thank you, Colonel. I hope this morning's events will encourage more thorough evaluation of contractors' actual capabilities rather than relying on assumptions based on marketing presentations or demographic characteristics. The comment reflected Sarah's understanding that her victory had implications that extended far beyond the immediate competitive situation, that her approach had exposed weaknesses in evaluation systems that could be corrected through more sophisticated assessment procedures. Sarah had won more than a contract. She had demonstrated the need for institutional changes that could improve military procurement outcomes across the entire defense contracting industry. As Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to leave Riverside Military Training Facility, she carried with her the satisfaction of someone who had achieved objectives that transcended mere professional success. Mitchell Defense Solutions would survive and prosper, but more importantly, Sarah had proven that strategic thinking and patient execution could overcome any disadvantage that circumstances might impose. The humid Virginia afternoon pressed against the assembly hall windows with unchanged persistence, but everything else had been transformed by the morning's events. Sarah Mitchell walked toward the exit with the confident stride of someone who had reminded the world exactly who she was and what she was capable of when the situation demanded. excellence rather than mere competence. Her floral dress caught the afternoon sunlight as she stepped outside, and for a moment she looked exactly like the housewife everyone had assumed her to be. But now everyone understood that appearances could be the most effective camouflage of all, and that sometimes the person you never see coming is the one who changes everything. Sarah Mitchell had proven that quiet strength could be more powerful than loud confidence, that patience could be more effective than aggression, and that the most profound victories often came from staying true to who you really were while letting others discover their assumptions were wrong. Her story would be remembered long after the immediate circumstances had been forgotten, serving as inspiration for anyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or overlooked because they didn't fit conventional expectations of what competence was supposed to look like. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the military facility as Sarah drove away in her aging Honda Civic, carrying with her the knowledge that she had achieved something rare and valuable. She had reminded everyone present that strength comes in many forms, that excellence can hide behind any appearance, and that the most dangerous opponents are often the ones you never see coming until it's too late to do anything except recognize that you've been outplayed by someone who understood the game better than you ever imagined possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.